Yeah, I think this topic we have here is a very interesting topic because headroom in construction. Why do we make provision for headroom and how it affects the structure? So oftentimes on site, especially when you are approaching your slab construction, you'll be hearing headroom, headroom. Both the carpenter and the engineer will be discussing about the reasonable headroom, the standard to be considered for the headroom. So we need to even understand what this headroom means in construction and how is it applied, the practical application of headroom. So headroom in construction is the vertical distance from the finished floor. When they say the finished floor, it includes your DPC, it includes your floor finishing, either your tiles or whatsoever you decide to use on your floor finishing. So it is the distance between the finished floor level to the finished ceiling or the lowest overhead obstruction. So from the finished floor to the finished ceiling. So the distance between the finished floor now to the finished ceiling is what is known as the headroom. So it ensures adequate space for occupants. Then it also helps to give comfort, ventilation, and the proper installation of services. Because once you give a reasonable headroom, there are still other installation and services that will be required at the end of the day. So proper headrooms create the rooms for you to install your fan, your other finishes on the building. Then correct headroom is essential for safety, functionality, and compliance with the building code. So it actually helps to give that room for safety. Then the functionality, that is the movement of people within the space provided, and the compliance with the building codes, because the building codes actually give specifications for this particular parts of construction. So you build in line with the building codes that has been given, or the one you chose to actually follow. So you build in line with the said code. So the key reasons why we actually make use of headroom in construction. So occupant comfort. So the comfort of the occupant is very, very essential, because you can't build a building whereby it becomes inhabitable. Sometimes you see some people construct a staircase and the first flight is too high, so the second flight will be too small, and becomes very, very difficult for you to scale through into the first floor of the building, so which tends to lead to discomfort of the occupants, right? So provides adequate space for people to move freely without feeling restricted, because in as much as the headroom is lower than expected, it helps to create that void and that discomfort. The next point is ventilation and air circulation. So allows proper air movement, improving indoor air quality and reducing stiffness. So ventilation is very, very important in construction. Air circulation within the building, inside the building, is very, very important. So it actually allows for proper air movement and improving indoor air quality, because the air quality indoor is very, very important, because you have people living inside the building. So you actually need to make that provision for an improved air quality. Then accommodation, that is accommodate services. So one of the important points is this accommodate services, because there are so many services coming into the already constructed building. So when you have a very good headroom, there are some installations that will come into the building depending on the type, be it residential or commercial, that some of these services requires spaces for. So if your headroom is too low, there are some of the services that can't be installed. Like for example, your ceiling fan, it can't be installed because it has its own specific height. When you take the height of the ceiling fan from the headroom provided, it might be too small. You understand? So that is why all these things are considered even during the construction. Ensure space for mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and HVAC installation without interference. So your installations should come, but it should be without interference. Then safety and compliance. So meet building codes, then requirements, and reduce risk of injury from low clearance. So low clearance is very very discomforting because it is very very important to have even a high clearance, because when you have a high headroom, you have spaces for other appliances. You understand? So, and it actually helps to reduce the risk of injuries, right? And it actually helps you to even meet the building standard that is required. Then increases value. So it actually helps to increase the value for your building. The functionality, then the usability, the aesthetic appeal, and adding even value to the property itself. So from occupant comfort to ventilation and air circulation to accommodate services, and safety and compliance, and increases value. So all these are key reasons, key important reasons why headroom is actually introduced. You understand, or is taking proper note of during construction. Because from your substructure, when you are moving into your superstructure, that is where you start thinking about your headroom, your provision for your headroom. Because all these electrical services, mechanical services, the HVAC services are coming on the plumbing and all those things. So you should be able to do all these services without interfering, the comfort of the occupant. So we are going to be looking at the application and uses, right, of this headroom. So residential buildings like living rooms, bedrooms, kitchen, bedrooms, all have these headroom. So headroom is used in all of these areas in residential buildings. Then commercial buildings like offices, shops, hotels, there are also reasonable headrooms that are given for your residential building. Then for commercial buildings, you also have a standard code for commercial buildings. Then industrial facilities and warehouses also have their own codes too. You understand the standard of the headroom that is given. Hospitals and healthcare facilities also have their own standard. Schools, lecture halls, and auditorium also have their own standard. You can't take the standard for your residential building and compare it with industries where you have movement of machineries, high machineries, big large heavy equipment, moving within the industrial space. You understand? So the headroom obtainable at the industry is different from the headroom obtainable, in a residential building, whereby it's just you and your family moving around, picking this and dropping here, dropping this and picking there. It's different, right? Then schools, lecture halls, and auditoriums. Then parking garage and basement areas. Then corridors, staircase, and lobbies. So both your corridor, your staircase, your lobby, all these areas of your building tends to have a specific headroom, right? Even your basement too, your parking lots have a specific headroom, because for your parking lot, you know the height of your car. You understand? You understand? You compare the height of your car, the height of the building itself, and all those things. So these are very very important consideration you make in construction. So we'll be taking a look at the typical headroom structure, right? Then from your slab, which is main load bearing element. Then we have the services zone. Your slab is there. Then below your slab is the services zone, where your mechanical, your electrical components, your HVC, space for MEP, pipes, ducts, and conduits are placed. Then we now have your suspended ceiling, which provides a smooth finishing ceiling surface. You understand? So from that ceiling surface to your finishes on the floor, you understand, is the clear headroom. You understand? So and we now have the floor finish. So all these are just the components that are obtainable on a building. So headroom is very, very important. It's very, very, very important. It actually gives, that space that you need. Actually gives you a clear space, of moving around your building.